Thank you. Let's start this breakout session, especially after the excellent general session we just had. This follows on, I think, very smoothly from that. And we have three outstanding speakers who really are going to speak for only about 5 to 7 minutes in order for us to be able to interact more and maybe get to questions that you might have had, some of the issues that are arising. One of them, Leslie had mentioned at the very end. What do you do in an interfaith setting? I'm Paul Kerry. I work with the International Center for Law and Religion Studies, and one of the areas that I work in is interfaith. And so her question caught my ear and made me think about things. I remember once, and Sharon Eubank was involved with this, the UN has many obligations when it comes to refugees. Ongoing education is not one of them. So what do you do when the average length of time in a refugee camp might be 10 to 12 years? How do you sustain education? Well, one thought was to produce books. Books aren't always taken with people when they become displaced in times of crisis. And so the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints issued a book for children in Arabic, and then undertook the decision not to put any imprint on it, that it wasn't from the church. There was no imprint. It was simply given out, and the intrinsic good was the education of children. And that was the good that really was agreed upon and overrode in that particular moment. In fact, I remember hearing Elder Jeffrey R. Holland, one of the apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, say, and this spoke to one of the other questions that came up about infrastructure and how those with cohesive infrastructures often are able to do a little bit better when needing to survive. He said in one of the Windsor dialogues that the International Center for Law and Religion Studies helps to sponsor over in London, he said, people can live without a lot of things. They can live sometimes without much food. They can live sometimes without much hygiene and nutrition. But they can't live without hope. They need to know that it's going to get better. And then he went on to put forward that it's faith that often helps in that area of providing hope, what sustains, and sometimes infrastructure, if you're in a particular kind of a community. So I hope this panel will continue some of the rich ideas and discussions that we had in the previous general session. Let me introduce our speakers, and then we'll start right into their remarks. Deborah Barry, directly to my left, is a senior humanitarian and leadership advisor at the Center for Humanitarian Leadership. She has 28 years of experience in the humanitarian sector, primarily working with youth, child protection, and development of leadership within this sector. She has worked with humanitarian organizations, government, UN agencies in over 100 countries of the world, so vast experience. Think about Russell Moore and what he said in our first session about working with youth, and here you see another approach to working with youth. Then, next to Deb is Jennifer Brewer, who is a global humanitarian consultant. She received an MA and an RDN and a dietetics degree right here from Brigham Young University and a master's from St. Mary's University. She focuses much of her work in Guatemala and Mozambique, where she works with various organizations to fight malnutrition and mental stunting in children. In 2017, she co-founded the Global Dietitian Group of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and served as the co-chair for 3 years. From 2021 to 2022, Jen was president for Care for Life. She is currently a global consultant working with NGOs around the world to help them review their operational plans and how they work within the humanitarian core principles. Jen works to build capacity of community members, local organizations, and create bridges with stakeholders, including health professionals and religious leaders. She has worked on several research groups studying the effects of interventions on sustainable solutions to malnutrition and poverty. Finally, Leslie, who posed one of these great questions in the last session, works with Church World Service Asia. She's the associate director there and U.S. Special Projects. Leslie Wilson became Church World Service Asia Regional Director in 2014, now the associate director, and is focused on housing and disaster preparedness recovery programs for refugees and newcomers to the United States. She's also worked with Save the Children for 15 years in South and Central Asia, the South Caucasus, and the Middle East. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in Thailand and Peace Corps staff in Moldova, In 2022, she supported CWS, member denomination's humanitarian response for Ukrainians there. As a St. Mary's College, which is in Notre Dame, Indiana, right across from Notre Dame University, graduate, Leslie received its Humanitatis Award for her life's work. She has a master's degrees in both from Northwestern and from Notre Dame universities. So with that, let's start. Deb, please.
Hi, everybody. It was a little off-putting when I saw the name Deborah in front of me. I'm usually known as Deb. I thought my mum was going to come after me. So just glad we're just to go with Deb and shorten the front. But yeah, it was really hard when I was given this topic to decide what to talk about when we think about how to really make it practical and applicable in the field and the work that we do within the humanitarian sector. And I went back to one of my first experiences working overseas in a conflict country. I was 17 when I first went to Romania and worked. And after that, my first conflict country was in 1999, out in Kosovo. And for those of you who remember the Kosovo conflict, there were many people who were killed at that stage. And it became really a big attention for the media. And I went in there just 2 weeks as the refugees were returning to that country. And I didn't speak the language. And I was 25. Looking back now, I was so inexperienced. At that point, I thought I could take on the world. But now looking back, there was a lot that I have now learned since that time. But I wanted to kind of go back to that because it did teach me a really important lesson that day. And I think in the audience that we have, that kind of lesson has remained with me. And it was, I remember in the west of Kosovo, 98% of the villages where I was working was destroyed. And many of the people who were killed were men and boys who had stayed to defend their communities. Many of the women and children left. I was there with the buses that returned from Macedonia and from Albania. As a 25-year-old, I can honestly say I was not used to mourning with those who mourn, but found myself being in that situation. I still remember the day that my driver came with me as we went to that first village where the mass graves were, and my driver just had to go back to the vehicle. He was my translator, he was my source of transport, and all I could do was stand there with those women, put my hands on their shoulder, touch my heart, and give them that look of compassion I know that we've all given at times of our lives. As I've reflected on the many countries and the many disasters I found myself in, I'm grateful for the lesson, which sounds a little strange sometimes, that sometimes it's good just to be silent, just to mourn with those that need to mourn. Because that's such an important part of the work that we have to do. Probably if I'd spoken the language, people would have expected me to say something about that conflict, to say something about how I felt about the politics that had come into play that day. What was my feeling about NATO now coming in? How did I feel about Serbians, Kosovan Albanians? But none of that could be said because I didn't have the language. And that has become something that's been really important to me because we live in a world where anything that we could say can be just given to the whole world. And so we talked about this, Mariana talked about this a little bit in the last session, the importance of that principle of neutrality and impartiality. And today, one of the examples I want to do is say why that is so important. It is because 6 months later, from that experience I had in Western Kosovo, I would then need to go into the villages and establish our programs with the Serbian community. They needed to have that trust in me. They needed to know that I was going to stand with them and think about their children and their communities. The world we live in is so small that 10 years later, I would be invited by the government of Serbia to go and help them develop their child protection policies for their whole country. If I had come out with big statements at that point, I could have completely changed the work that we needed to do to protect children across the world. Now, that didn't mean that as the organization I was working for a large British non-profit organization at the time, they could make statements. They could talk about protecting the children. They could talk about stopping the conflict, about bringing peace. But my role on the ground in that very moment was to stand there, to talk to them and build that trust in the community. Everybody has a role to play within that sector. Mariana talked in the last session about the humanitarian principles, and I just want us to remember those, which was humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And those were developed in 1965 and have continued to be in operation for us today. The reason why these things are so important is they're just not just words. We need to actively be involved in thinking about how we can put this into practice. And there's so much good that can come when we do put them into practice. Some of the other speakers in the other sessions have talked about the protection that we can feel when they know that we are there to work solely with them in the community. I have worked in some of the most horrific countries of the world, where usually when I tell my friends and family I'm going there, they go, oh no, please don't. But I know that if I follow these principles and I am true to the promises that I know and the things that I know to be right, that I will be able to go in there and be protected. Because you do have to have these principles in place. They're not just words. And I strongly believe that I wouldn't be sitting here today without those principles being fully in action. But one of the things I want to do is actually think about why is it so important then that faith-based organizations really try to put this into practice? And why is it that we have to provide humanitarian aid to all people? And we could spend a whole session talking about the humanitarian principles, but there are ways that we can do it in a really kind of clear and proactive way. The first thing we need to do is that we have to actively be promoting it. And we can't just sit on the front lines and say, yes, come here, come to my building, and we'll give it to you. We need to know, actually, are people going to feel comfortable coming to a certain location? Is that location somewhere that feels neutral to people coming? It's such an important part. It sounds so simple, but the number of community people I know will say, I don't want to go there, because usually, for example, if I'm in certain countries, men and women wouldn't usually line up together. So I have to make sure that women feel protected and safe when they're going to line up. Do I know if they need to have a male chaperone with them? Have I made allowances for that in an all-female lineup? If I've got women who really do need to breastfeed and we promote that, is there somewhere they don't have to stay in a long line, they can actually get that support? But I do have to work with the whole community to be able to understand what those principles are. And that means we come very early on that we think about all of their beliefs. Is it okay for them? Do I need to put some kind of cover down the middle for them not to see people of other genders or other faiths? Those are practical ways that we can actually think about this question. We also need to educate our staff and volunteers about the importance of neutrality. 2 months ago, I was in Poland running a training for crisis leadership program for young humanitarians. New people. Poland, you all know what's been on the news the last year. It was so hard for a country like that to now be doing a response. And so when we did the first day of the training, one of the first things that came back said, we really struggle with that idea of neutrality. If I see somebody who is Russian, am I really going to help them? What will my family think if I'm found to be helping somebody else? Very sincere questions that they wanted a safe space to have that discussion. Neutrality is so important, but it has to be something that you're willing to talk about and challenge some of those things that could easily be there. Oh, yeah, sorry. Oh, my time went super fast. I just wanted to give another example of where we can do on kind of policy side. And that was something that is very controversial within faith-based organizations. And that was the issue of orphanages and the work that we do in orphanages. And so often, faith-based organizations work around the world in orphanages. And I just wanted to give you quick statistics. At the moment, $3.3 billion comes from the US to support orphanages. The majority of that, 93% of it, comes from faith-based organizations. 86% of Christians out of a 3,000 people study said this is where children should be, that they felt that orphanages were a good thing. Now, we could have a whole seminar on what actually is the problem for orphanages and why they are not the best place for children. But 92% of those children actually have a living parent. And those are the statistics we're dealing with. In Haiti, after the earthquake, 150% increase in the number of children going into orphanages. We are, as faith-based organizations, no matter what faith you are, talk about strengthening the family. If we are true to our beliefs, no matter who we are, that we really want to strengthen the family unit, no matter what that family unit looks like, we would not be promoting orphanage work. The amount of money that goes into supporting those orphanages could go into strengthening the home and family. It is that kind of change that when Mariana talked about what do we want to change, that is the reason for it. We want children to be in a family unit, in that environment where we know that they can have that. If you think that 3.3 billion just came from US faith-based organizations, think of the difference that would make if we decided to program in a different way. And it's with that that I know that we can advocate for change.
Hello, and thank you so much for this opportunity to be here and talk about one of the great desires of my heart. I want to take you on these next few minutes on a journey. We're going to zoom out and look at humanitarian work and faith-based organizations from kind of an ethereal point of view, and then we're going to zoom in and look at it from the grassroots in 5 to 7 minutes. Wish me luck. So a few months ago, I had the opportunity to go visit the Museum of Natural History in New York City. I am no stranger to museums. I have 7 kids. We've been to hundreds. What was different in this time was I only had my adult daughter with me. And you know what that meant? I got to read the plaques. I got to stop. I got to meander. I got to do what I wanted to do. What I saw amazed me. I started to see correlations. And of course, my nerdy brain started to put things together. And so I started to look for different correlations and anyone that diverted. What I found, every civilization that has existed, at least in the Museum of Natural History, had 2 very distinct things in common. It did not matter the time that they existed, the geography in which they existed, or their culture. Every culture had this in common. Number 1, how they cared for and dealt with the death and their burials. Number 2, which fascinated me, was their connection to something greater than themselves. Every organization or every civilization. Now, how that played out, very different, very vastly. But I was fascinated. Every civilization that has existed has had this yearning, what I am going to deem religiosity. We've had this yearning to connect to something greater than our mortal selves. Why is that a problem now, or how does that have anything to do with humanitarian work now? Well, because in the past century, it seems like humanity, or at least in the United States, has worked very hard to exclude religion from the equation. And we still want to keep getting the same results. We try not to bring that with us. Now, I am not talking about what Deb brought up and what Sharon brought up and Mariana in how we offer services. We do not promote any religiosity. We do not promote religion. It's very important to be neutral. What I'm talking about is what we bring to the table is our authentic selves. And if we try to leave our own personal religiosity at home, I don't care what that is, there's a piece missing from the equation. When we bring that with us, we then invite others to actually trust us more, which is really ironic how that works. That it then opens them up to bring their authentic self to the table and builds that bridge of trust. Again, how does this have anything to do with humanitarian work? I'm getting there. So I have a little parable to share with you. Some of you may have heard this. I'm going to tweak it a little bit. A man brought an elephant into a village one day. He came upon 5 blind men, and he told them, each of you may touch this elephant in one spot. If you can agree on what this is, what this looks like, and describe it to me, it's yours. You can have it. They got so excited. The first man grabbed the ear and said, I know exactly what this is. This is a fan. I know just what we can do with it. The next man grabbed the tail and said, you're mistaken. This is a rope, and it's going to be perfect. I know exactly how it can help us. The third man said, you're both wrong. This is a wall. It's ginormous. It's strength. This is going to be powerful. This is a powerful animal. I can't wait to have it. The fourth said, you guys are all bonkers. This is a tree trunk. And he was, of course, grabbing onto the leg and said, this can be so powerful in the usage that we can do. It's like a vast tree. The fifth said, you are all mistaken. This is a snake, and I know exactly how we can utilize this. The 5 men then continued to argue, could not come to any consensus. 2 hours later, the owner of the elephant shrugged his shoulders, took the elephant away. They could not come to any consensus on what each of them brought to the table. They were so in their silo of what they each knew. When we get stuck in our own systems and our own religiosity and forget to open up, that we don't know what we don't know, we only see our one corner, we are like those 5 men arguing. We compare to glare instead of compare to share and create something greater than any one part of us can do. Why is this important to humanitarian work? Because, as they brought up in the past session, the majority of people engaged in humanitarian work are doing it through a faith-based group. People who do humanitarian trips are doing it through faith-based groups. It's so important that we reach out and we teach, are you helping? At the very least, are you not hurting? And when I counsel with people and when I train organizations, we go through seven distinct principles that we teach. I'm going to just touch on 2 briefly. One of those is leave your cape at home. We are not heroes. We are not going to go save the world in a week. Now, I need to delineate very distinctly. There is acute need. The example of that is if somebody's drowning, you don't yell to them, try the backstroke, take some swimming lessons. You jump in and you save them. If somebody has had their house wiped out, they need clothes, they need shelter, they need food. You give it to them. You give the aid. Most churches are phenomenal at giving that aid, walking in, jumping in, helping what needs to be helped. The problem that happens is this other sector of humanitarian world, and that's actually my love, is the sustainable help. This chronic needs and malnutrition, which is my heart, is what do we do after the food drives end? How are these families fed after the initial jump and dump goes home? What then? What happens? And that's where I come in to teach organizations how to help without hurting. So we teach people first and foremost, you are not a hero. If you come in as a hero, you automatically make somebody a victim. And that is no way to have a relationship. And that is no way to give or receive help. We need to do this with reciprocity. We need to see people as human beings and create this dignity that every human craves for, regardless of what emotional state they're in. So we leave it at home. We go in as helpers, not as white saviors coming in to save the day. Number 2 is what we call the shadow leadership principle. If I am up teaching a class, automatically something is wrong. It needs to be community to community. That's how things are best learned and how change is best learned if it's within people helping people. One thing that Mariana brought up, it's neighbors helping neighbors. How can we help instill that? How can we go in and say, I'm here as a resource for you? How can I help you so you can be the one to train? One quick example that I'll share is we went down with some medical people to a very incredibly cut off community in Guatemala. We had a medical team there. Services they don't have. That's acceptable, right? I was walking around and I noticed their health clinic was closed. And I thought, that's strange. And then it hit me like a Mack truck. I thought, we are putting their medical personnel out of business. Who is going to pay this person who has brought himself out of his own poverty, gone and received training, is now coming back to serve his community the best that he or she can, when the Americans are going to come in and give the service for free? When we leave, are they going to go pay again? They're going to wait for the next group to come. We have just established hurt, not help, with that situation. All it takes is a tweak. If we can go in and instead teach behind the scenes, train that medical personnel, then we've left something that can leave us, that can last way beyond when we leave. So we have people ask 3 fundamental questions when they go into help. Number 1, who should be doing what I am doing? If I am in a country painting a wall, something is very wrong. We need to stimulate their own economy, somebody to help themselves out of that. What can I do to help that and aid that? Number 2, who is learning from what I am doing? Okay? In other words, what can they do tomorrow because I was here today? Will the ripple effects last so I don't produce the learned helpless effect, that I leave and they just sit and wait for the next load to come? Number 3, what will they do when I leave? Again, will they sit and wait for the next group to come in? Or has this community learned and grown, and have we helped them to see the skills that they have internally and the hope that they have, that they can then work their own systems, build their own programs with the added boost of just a cheerleader almost. You've got this. You can do this. We believe in you. To circle back, if we as religious organizations can bring that belief of helping humanity, if we can bring that to the table, knowing full well, maybe I'm touching the tail, maybe I'm touching the fan, and we can get together with this whole group of people, we can create an elephant that can actually eradicate some of the problems that we currently face in our humanitarian crisis around the world. Thank you.
Hello. All right, there I am. Hi, Leslie Wilson, and I work for Church World Service right now. Deb started her remarks with a bit of an origin story about her first work in Kosovo. And she talked about a call to humanitarian action, which is what we're all here to talk about today. So I thought I would share my origin story in this kind of work. When I was in my mid-30s, I was working in a very nice job at Northwestern University Medical School, not as a healthcare professional, but as a fundraiser. And here I was. It was a good job. I had great colleagues. Some of my family were in Chicago. I had a lot of friends. Chicago's a great city. But somehow, after a number of years in that job, I just thought, yeah, there's got to be more to life than this. So unbeknownst to myself, I fulfilled a childhood dream, which someone else reminded me about when we were at a 40th high school reunion. Oh, Leslie, I remember when we were sitting at the pool one day when we were about 13 and you said, you know what, when I grow up, I'm going to be a Peace Corps volunteer. I had zero recollection of that teenage statement that I had made, but there I was at age 34 and I decided I'm going to join the Peace Corps. And so I did. It was a very competitive process. It took a year, but that was my sort of step into the world of sustainable development and then into humanitarian work. Now, typically, the work that Peace Corps volunteers do is more sustainable development. It's slow, it's incremental. You go in, you spend 10 or 12 weeks in training, learning the language, getting acculturated, whatever, and then you get into your village and you sort of ease your way in and figure out, you have your assignment, but what does the village, what does the community really want you to do? But I went into a village where, this is in 1990, I went into a series of villages where there had been a typhoon on the Gulf of Thailand. 150 or so fishermen were killed. And so the women had to go to work to help reclaim the villages, clear the debris. And all of a sudden there were a bunch of children who needed childcare. Me with my MBA from Notre Dame and my literary degree from Northwestern University, of course I would go help with early childhood education, right? No. But anyway, that was my assignment, and with the Peace Corps, you go where you're called. So off I went, and that was, that's my origin story with this kind of work. It was transformative in my life, and here we are today. So that said, I want to just quickly come forward from those many years ago and note that here today, in 2023, with everyone in the world, it seems, increasingly aware, for good or for ill, when something is going on anywhere in the world, we just know so much more about the towns and villages of the world. And in this, it seems to me there's an ever-present opportunity, and I use the word advisedly, an ever-present opportunity to respond to the call for humanitarian action. So wherever you are in your life's journey, if you're in undergraduate, if you're in law school, if you're getting close to retirement, if you're in the middle of a career in humanitarian work or church work, there's always a place, and a time to respond. And to respond, as Deb referenced, with humanity, with neutrality, with impartiality, and I would add, with humility. We have to respond with humility, not with the white savior complex or with arrogance of any sort. And for many of us, and I would say probably for most of us at this symposium today, we're responding to a call from God, Yahweh, Allah, however we characterize it. We're responding to a call, and we want to go and be helpful, be positive, be purposeful in the world. For others who join from a not faith tradition, if you will, from a not faith base, they might join the Peace Corps. Peace Corps is a government secular organization. Teach for America, become a United Nations volunteer. All of those are secular organizations. They would characterize their work as communitarian or humanitarian. But it really doesn't matter to the people to whom we are responding. It matters to us, as was said in one way or another in all the sessions. It matters to us why we're responding. Is it a call from God, or who's it a call from? But to the people who, in the midst of a crisis, it doesn't matter to them if we're Catholic or Jewish or Muslim or whatever in the moment. If there is a humanitarian crisis and a need for aid, it doesn't matter why we're called. We need to act, for ourselves on that call, but we need to act with humility and impartiality. So this brings me back to the point about faith-based organizations, but then I would add in secular organizations like Save the Children, like Mercy Corps, like the International Rescue Committee. When we act to provide any kind of assistance, material assistance, healthcare, physical assistance, if it's a disaster and people are injured, emotional aid, as Deb said, she didn't speak a word of the Kosovar language, but she could be there. She could put her hand here and look and show an expression of empathy, sympathy, solidarity. So however we go in, regardless of whoever we're trying to be helpful and of service to, doesn't matter what their religion is, doesn't matter what the color of their skin is, their race, it doesn't matter what their gender is, we're called to service to everyone. And also, again, everything is reflective of what my dear friend and colleague Deb has said. I would suggest that we can be the voice. We can actively promote values of inclusion and acceptance, especially in humanitarian crises, which tragically are everywhere all the time. Faith-based organizations, humanitarian organizations can work together. We all can, and Marianne talked about that at the end. How can we create a code of conduct that is for all of us? And like Deb said, during the past couple weeks, she's given a lot of thought to what we would say in this moment. I have to say I'm a little bit overwhelmed by the physical space here, but nonetheless, it makes me feel sort of important to be in such a big room. But I want to use that to transition into the work that I'm doing now, and my pages are stuck together, so there's going to be a trick. So now I, as was mentioned in the introduction, I work for Church World Service. Actually, for 7 years, I was in Asia as the Asia Regional Director. But 2 years ago, having transitioned all my country representatives to national positions, no more Westerners in any of those jobs. I had a Cambodian, a Vietnamese person, an Indonesian person, a Timor-Lestean. I said, okay, this part of our mission is done here. I'm going to go ahead and do something different. So I came back to the United States and started to work. For the first time, really, that work was all development. It was not humanitarian response for the most part. It wasn't urgent. It was day-to-day, in and out, working in your communities on a grassroots level to improve nutrition, to improve health. In the end, we ended up responding a lot to the COVID crisis, but again, it was characteristically typical development work. But when I came back to the States and said to Church World Service, so what can I do now? Within 6 months of my being here, things fell apart in Afghanistan, where I had been for 6 years, in a much, much better, more positive, hopeful time. I was there sort of at the very beginning, after Kabul came away from Taliban rule the first time 20 years ago. And of course, as it turned out, the leader of our program said, well, Leslie, of course you have to help us with the Afghan situation. 70,000 Afghans are going to be here tomorrow, and we need to get them onto army bases and then off army bases and into homes, which led me to the project I work on now, which is called Refugee Housing Solutions. So 80,000 Afghans, 100,000+ Ukrainians, and then all of the, what we call regular refugees, the people who have been vetted in Nairobi, Kenya, in Bangkok, Thailand, used to be in Kyiv, Ukraine, well, now they're being vetted in Chisinau, Moldova. People who go through a long vetting process to get to come to the United States legally. So there's 125,000 refugees expected in this current year. So all of these people, and I'm on a project working to find safe, affordable housing in the midst of an American housing crisis. There's not safe, affordable housing for many, many Americans, and we know this. And so there's where I am. In the midst of something where everyone in this room has got a newcomer, a refugee, somewhere very close to where you live. So if you're looking for something to do immediately, go home and find your local resettlement agency and reach out and see what you and your family and your friends or whatever can do to help a refugee family feel welcome and safe and at home in our country. And then when you have a time to think about it a little bit more, no matter what age you are, think about joining the Peace Corps. And with that said, we're all called to action by our faith and by our hope. And I'm just grateful for the opportunity to be with Deb and Jen and with you all today. Thank you.
Let's field questions. Do we need a microphone for these questions? Do we need to run a mic? Yes, okay, thank you. Somebody's going to get very fit running up and down these stairs.
It's Jeff Robinson. Thanks for your words. What would you tell a 15-year-old who has instincts? Some of you talked about how you started out and high school conversations. What would you tell a 15-year-old daughter, for example, that wants to do something that's brought it up 5 times to her deadbeat dad, and her dad's just having a hard time trying to let her express those good instincts that she has? Thoughts or ideas at a young age?
I would definitely say I was definitely one of those. My parents would definitely have great sympathy for the hypothetical person. But as a 17-year-old, my parents said to me, when I saw the fall of Ceausescu, I was like, I have to do something. And my parents actually started me off by saying, what are you doing locally now? And that actually meant me going into my community and starting work there as well. And I think that helped me to understand a lot of those principles right at the beginning. Find there are so many people in need. I have a great privilege in being able to do my job, but it comes from actually starting in your own community. And charity begins at home. Truly is, you start in your own family, then your extended family, and then your community. And just having those conversations on a regular basis about what do people need? What do you hear that's different now about what does your neighbor need? Quite often we think of something really big, but actually it might not be that. It could be something really simple. And I think actually if you get into that questioning differently about, tell me about you. How can I help you? It's a very different relationship. And you start practicing that really young, so as you get older, you can start out on a much bigger scale.
Yeah, I would just reiterate with Deb, feed her ambitions and ask her what that looks like to her. and let her take it. If she wants to go somewhere abroad, research programs, and let her see, let her vet where her desires take her, where she feels like she needs to go, even if it's just to go see, to go try and see. I've done many trial and errors to get to where I am now, but it starts with that itch of, I got to do something. I got to do something. So yeah, have her lead it of where she wants to go and what she wants to do.
Have her go to college, get a degree, and join the Peace Corps.
Should I wait for the?
Why not wait, Dr. Ivins? Thank you.
Okay. So piggybacking on that, I have a 15-year-old, and last weekend we had a vigil for another 15-year-old who took his life. And it's the fourth in the last month of young teens who've taken their lives in our community. And I've just been thinking about, I do work in West Africa, and I've seen people with so little work so hard to survive. And I've just wanted to give the vision to some of these 15-year-olds that come from families that seem so well cared for, to maybe connect them to the realities of so many other people their age across the world. So I'm just curious, what role could faith-based groups play for those kinds of linkages? Maybe some of you saw A Man Called Otto, or like A Man Called Uwe, but this idea that in the quest of serving someone else, you find purpose and meaning, and therefore have the hope to keep going despite everything else falling apart.
I'm going to be really bold and say a lesson that I listened to once from, what did I just forget her name? Oh, Brene Brown, in the middle of COVID. She made a statement once, and I don't agree with everything she says, but I do like some things, is she said, empathy is not pizza. There aren't only 8 slices to go around. That comparative suffering can actually do more damage than good, of saying, look how good you have it, you shouldn't be sad. I think one quote that Sharon brought up in her talk that really resonated with me is that sociality that people have, and helping the teenagers like understand their heart is hard, that help them grow a network within themselves of what is hard for them. I would always take somebody abroad. There are so many lessons that I feel that could happen abroad. And yes, there are lessons that are learned from that, but I'd be very careful to utilize that as kind of a hidden agenda type of a thing. And I'm speaking because I did this with my kids. I took them abroad, and our first time I said, look at how little they have, look at how much you have, patted myself on the back. So learn from my mistakes. Don't do that. So that's my thought. Just let them do their own network.
And I think there's great power in, again, just going back to your own community and understanding it. I've had the chance during COVID to, after doing 23 years overseas, to get grounded because of COVID. And just to be so active in my own community really taught me and has reprioritized my time. Because I do realize how many transferable skills I have. And that has been super important with the youth. And now we have these youth programs, and part of what we're developing at the Center for Humanitarian Leadership is a crisis leadership program for youth, to actually make sure they're engaged in the grassroots level, right from that very beginning of learning what does it mean. And I just did it with Polish and Ukrainian youth, and who are, frontline responders. And even though they can see what's going on, they can't stop the politics, they can't change the governments and the decisions made, but they can give aid. And I take that back to the children. I came back from Ukraine, and the children in Wales really wanted to do something for their own community to welcome. They knew, just like Leslie was saying, they wanted to really make sure that all the children who came from Ukraine to Wales felt so welcomed. Flags went up everywhere. I came back, I was in tears as I saw, as a person who was just returning from Ukraine and Poland, I was amazed that these children, and it was the children, who gave this outpouring of love to your own community. And as I talk to Ukrainian children now who are settling back in this community, they have said, we didn't think people would love us. And I think that is the bigger message, right? We go back to this hope. What's the light of hope we want to see? And if you can do that for every single child in your community, you then don't have to have the fortune of having all of those extra resources to take your child overseas to give them that experience. You're showing that love and hope comes when you go back to asking those questions and bringing all that back to your own community. And then you take that question bigger and you say to them, and one of the things we did with these youth is say, let's map out your community. You tell me geographically, what does your community look like today? You tell me about who are the vulnerable people and why they are. And sometimes the vulnerability that they tell me about, I couldn't have even made up. They're vulnerable because maybe their dad has a job that doesn't look good in the community. He's a police officer. Now that child's really marginalized because there's power in that household. I would never have thought that. In Afghanistan, one of the things that we learned, who were the children most afraid of in Afghanistan? The UN workers flying along in those white vehicles because they didn't stop, or the military forces who were there to protect because they were flying at such speeds. For their security, they'll tell you it's for their security, and yes. So we have to talk to the people to find out what is that real concern and then work with them at that grassroots level.
I have what's kind of an observation and maybe a question as well, but I'd appreciate your responses to it. I spent 4 years in Guatemala working with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And one thing that we saw frequently, and I think you see it in a lot of other places, is what I would call aid tourism, where you have people and they're very well intentioned, they want to come down, and they bring usually groups of kids, often they're church groups, and they'll come down and they'll go into a community and they'll do something, they'll build something or whatever it is, and then pack up and go home and say, boy, we had a wonderful experience there. But there's a lot of question about how much good that really does, other than just making people feel good who have come on this trip. And I think one comment that maybe kind of a series of comments that's been made here that I think is a good answer to that question, because the first question I had in my mind was, well, how do you avoid doing that and go do something that's really meaningful? And that kind of came out of this idea of take your kids abroad and have them check out these things. I think that's great. I've lived overseas for probably about half my life, and I think living overseas is a great thing. But I think that one of the comments was, first focus on your local, your family, your extended family, your community, and develop your understanding of what aid is necessary and what aid is helpful in that context before you go running around doing that with other people in other places where you don't really understand the place and you may not understand all the dynamics. And I think there was a comment before about unintended consequences of the things that you do. Maybe it was in the general session. So with that kind of rambling comment, could you please just give your thoughts on that subject and how you make sure that the aid that you're providing is really meaningful and helpful and not just feel good, pat yourself on the back aid tourism. Thank you.
So I'll go ahead and start, but speak specifically to what Jen said, is don't do anything. Go and help the community do what it needs. So don't go in with a mobile clinic once a year to do X. Go in and find out who the healthcare workers are and what their levels of skills are and work with them and maybe work in tandem with them, for a time so that they can continue. And then maybe your backstop is you make sure that they have the supplies they need, the medicine, whatever, on an ongoing basis. Deb and I spent many years in Afghanistan, and again, in more promising and different times. But the most important things that our organization did was education and training of illiterate or semi-literate healthcare workers, community healthcare workers. In the years we were there, NGOs, nonprofit organizations from around the world trained tens of thousands of midwives and community health workers, and it helped nurses and doctors improve their skills. So it was about, I hate the term capacity building, but it was about capacity building, skill development, knowledge, what have you. And one of my consolations about Afghanistan now, and of course I was there quite a long time ago, 2003 to 2009, is that many young women and boys were educated in that time. And once you educate someone, you can't take that away. And so once someone has a skill, you can't take it away. So while the Taliban is doing whatever they are doing, which is the same as they did 30 and 40 years ago, which is not much, except, well, anyway, won't go there. Sorry. But those people, those young children who we helped, educate, or their teachers, can continue to do what they do. Yes, it's not ideal and it's sort of underground, especially for the girls or whatever, but skill building, knowledge building, information sharing, and of course, in this digital world where everyone's connected, figuring out ways to stay in touch. It's so easy to do now. So I would say that skill building thing.
I'm going to jump in because you're speaking to my heart. This is a hill I will die on this battle right here. And it comes down to education. In fact, we're taking a group in August to Guatemala, and the informal name of it is the anti-humanitarian trip. And what we're doing is going in to see the project, what's left in the wake of the groups that leave. That we're going to visit the sites and what happened with this community garden that the outsiders came and planted that's non-existent, or the ambulance that was driven from Chicago and now has plants growing out of it. To see firsthand, so people will still get the experience, because there is a lot to be had just from the cultural experience, but to see people as humans, not as victims. So it's a lot of education that we've already started with people that are signing up for the trip, of books you need to read, of these stipulations. You're not going down to save the day, you're going down to learn, and you're going down to see people and to learn from them, and to see what does humanitarian work mean and how do you help without hurting. But thank you for bringing that up.
I know we're nearly running out of time. I'm going to get the look in a second. But I just wanted to, one thing as I was listening to Jen and Leslie, and a little tangent I echo everything that they've said. But I guess that kind of call to action as we leave here today would also be to, if there are certain groups of people as well, or certain situations, or conflicts, or things that you find yourself siding on and saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe this has happened, or I can't believe this is happening in the world. Going back to the education side, I would ask you to think about knowing the one. Find their stories. There's amazing stories out there of some of these people who have been through this. I was working quite a few years ago on the Macedonia-Serbian, ironically, border. And I was with a group of refugees, and I said, what can I do to help you? And they said to me, please don't forget us. Mm-hmm. And that has stuck with me the whole time, that I don't forget those 4 women and 2 men who had made the journey. And they said, please tell our story. And when it's appropriate, I do. And when I don't have the time to tell the story, I ask us to find the stories of the people who are out there. We should never forget that at the heart of everything that we do, it's the one person. And we do it to help those people. But if we kind of put everyone together and say, all of this group of people, all of this faith, or all of this nationality, or this group has this action happening to them, then we keep those biases within us. So a lot of what we do, and a lot of what we teach children, especially in the youth that I work with, is about how to break down those unconscious biases that we have. When you see the news, think about, how do I react? And then think about, how can I change some of that so I am more neutral and impartial? That doesn't mean that you don't share your opinions, but you share them in a constructive way, and not to blame. I love from the opening this morning that we had, because the majority, are amazing people in the world. And it is an absolute privilege to be in every one of those 100 countries I've been able to work in. But media, social media, will have you believe something else. So please change your mindset, find out that education, and become impartial so that you can then help educate your children and take away some of that fear. That's the biggest lesson we give all the time to parents. People ask us, what can we do to help our children? And I say, try to reduce their fear. Teach them about the facts. But you've got to know how to find those facts as well.
Yep. We do have time for one more question. Oh, we've got 2. If we could keep them succinct, maybe squeeze the 2 in, please.
On the flip side to this idea of, of aid tourism, or white savior syndrome. I feel like I've worked with youth in various countries who have had that message so deeply imbibed in them, and they're conscientious and thoughtful and socio-politically aware, that I think the pendulum, we risk sometimes the pendulum swinging to the other extreme of fear to act because they know they can do harm. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are or insight when I feel like with our younger generations, the pendulum is perhaps swung too far the opposite way, actually, that there is a fear to act because they realize they can do damage. They know they can do damage if they're unthinking. How do you address that? There is a bias to action in humanitarian aid. If someone is you meet the needs. But I feel like we might have swung far away from that. How do we address that tension? Because it's a real tension.
Go ahead. Yeah, I think when we talk about some of these programs that we've been able to do, a lot of times we are talking about allowing children, giving a voice. And I think, whether we look at Afghanistan, where we set up children's consortiums to actually, through this model of children learning together, that gave them permission to act. The people who were facilitating those conversations actually weren't doing it, but they were giving them that permission that you were talking about. And right now in Wales, that's what we're doing again, is going through school to school and saying to children, now at your school level, at your parent-teacher association, at your school governor groups, how are you acting? You have this voice. Let's have a discussion on how it's going to be. And I think it's about them realizing that can be done. But again, once you learn that from a community standpoint, you can then go out further. But it's about giving permission. And I think, we talk a lot in the world these days about contracting with each other and recognizing and giving consent. And that consent has to be something out there. And you can say something like, as a parent, as an aunt, as an uncle, as a community leader, you can all give those people that you work with that consent to do this. You can make a difference. And actually, when you do say it, it's super empowering to them, and then they tell their friends. And so I think it's about us being very kind of proactive in the language that we use, and knowing, and again, using good and bad examples, just like Jen said. Do you mean find those good examples of what's really made a difference, and then also highlight, let's not make that mistake again, let's learn from that.
Dr. Friedrichsen, perhaps you could come down because we just hit time and address the panel just down here when we're finished. Let's give the panel a hand. Thank you.